So a little while ago, I released a track called Arcane Skies, which I worked on with my friend Robert Lampkin, and we also had it recorded by Budapest Scoring, and featuring vocals from Julie Ellen. This was probably the most challenging project I've ever mixed so far, so let's walk through how I approached it. We received a lot of tracks, each of it being for a different mic position, and also for each instrument group. So I essentially took how each group is arranged in an orchestra and panned them accordingly, while also taking some creative liberties for a few instruments. So for example, with the strings here, I have most of the violins panned hard left, with some slight deviations to keep that side of the stereo field more dynamic. And you'll also see how I have, for the last two violin tracks, I have them panned slightly more center to, once again, keep the stereo field dynamic and also keep the seating arrangement closer to reality. For the violas, I have them panned somewhat to the right, with some slight deviations as well. And also the same thing for the cello. I panned them pretty hard right, along with some slight deviations, along with the contrabass. Also, excuse me, while I'm thinking about it, I will solo this folder as well, and you will see why a little later. So for the trumpets, I didn't really touch them a whole lot, since I wanted them to sit mostly in the center of the mix. And with horns, I actually panned these somewhat to the left, and trombones somewhat to the right. Now, from what I can gather, this isn't really a common arrangement for an orchestra. However, over the years, I've simply just grown fond of how these instruments sound in the left and right respectively, so it's just kind of a personal preference now. And tubas are panned mostly in the center as well, with a very slight pan to the left. Now for the woodwinds, specifically for the flutes, I have them panned somewhat to the right, along with the bassoon, and I also have the oboes and the clarinets panned somewhat to the left. Finally, we also received two surround mic tracks, one for the left and right, so I panned them hard left and hard right respectively. When we play all of these tracks together, you'll hear we actually already have a very wide stereo image, and we also already have a good chunk of free space in the center of the mix, which will be super helpful when we are implementing Julie's vocals along with our really huge percussion. So let's try it out and see how this sounds. Like about here. Sweet. So now, one of the most daunting parts of this project was layering for virtual instruments with the recorded takes in a way which sounds both natural and also effectively augments the overall sound. However, there was one thing which actually made this whole process a lot simpler for me, and I will demonstrate it with an example. I will actually pull up one of my horn lines here, and let me go over to, I think this is the Pre-City theme, I believe. So let's listen to this. Right, so you hear how the horn take gets gradually louder from like about here to here? And also notice how this take also sounds quite close and dry in the mix. Well, I can essentially use this information to help me set up my virtual horns, and you'll see that that is exactly what I did. So, if we go and check out the virtual horn I implemented a little further down, it's pretty far down here. Yeah, here we are. So if we open up my settings here for this horn, just screen, so let me bring that over here. I activated the close mic for my horn, and I also panned it so it takes up roughly the same area as the recorded take in the stereo image. However, I had it slightly panned more centered since it kind of still has a room-ish sound, so I didn't necessarily want to have it panned really hard left. And then when I was recording the MIDI, I made sure that the virtual horn starts playing the notes and that it also swells at the same time as the recorded take. So actually, let's hear it. And because of this, we get a stronger and clearer sound while still retaining the realism of the recorded take. I'm also then able to apply any necessary EQing, excitation, distortion, really whatever. And I also applied this process whenever I wanted to layer a virtual instrument over a recorded take. And thankfully, the whole process was a lot simpler than I was anticipating. For the overall mixing process, I really wanted to go for an over-the-top, in-your-face epic trailer sound. So to do this, I focused on a few main factors, which we'll also explore a little more in depth as we go. We have first synth layers, massive choirs, width, and reverb. Let's start with synths. So, I generally only layered synths in the loud and chaotic sections. For the quieter sections, however, I generally left synths out, except for the pre-city section here. I have a really low synth pad, helping kind of fill out the low end in the first part of the pre-city section to essentially keep it from feeling empty. So now let's actually take a look at a louder section that I needed to add some synths into. So specifically to do that, we will look at about 103 here. So if we hang out at around here, you can see I have some, although it looks really quiet here, it's actually louder. However, I essentially have some pace of virtual instruments playing the root of each chord. So if we solo the low stuff again and play. Oh, that's okay. Yeah. Now, in the context of the full mix, it's a bit hard to hear. However, if you listen close, you'll almost hear what sounds like some metallic, sci-fi-esque, really evil droning underneath the already insane wall of noise. Let me turn that back down a little bit. The synths also kind of sound like a really huge and menacing monster actually growling underneath the orchestra, which helps further establish the really evil and menacing vibe here. Now, still examining the same section, let's check out the choir. Which is, I believe, a little further up here. Okay. Let's listen to just the choir itself. So it sounds pretty huge and wide, right? I really love the vibrato in the high register in particular, which really drives home the chaotic vibe here. But now let's hear it in context of the full mix. It's kind of funny since the choir actually almost sounds even larger than it did on its own. And this is Oceania 2, and it is by far my favorite choir VST. It fits perfectly for this really epic trailer production style. And just to give you an idea of like how much power this choir actually brings, let's hear this same section without it. Now, it still sounds good, however, it doesn't really sound as huge and chaotic. So choirs really like work wonders, honestly. And I also want to mention that I also have a pipe organ playing the same notes as the choir, acting as a sort of additional layer to make the choir sound more massive and imposing. Let's actually listen to them together as well, real quick. The organ was right out here, yeah. So the organ and choir are actually pretty close to each other in overall volume, but in the full mix, you don't really hear the organ as much. And I think this is because the overall sound of the choir actually stands out more in context of the rest of the mix when compared to the organ's overall sound. Now, the other thing I want to note here is that in this particular section, the choir is used more as a background layer. So I want to actually look at a section where the choir has a much more prominent and leading role. And the section I'm referring to here is the city theme. So yeah, I need to solo the choir again real quick. So when we just listen to the choir, you can tell right away that it has a much more prominent role, and there is a defined melody and rhythm specifically. If we also bring in the horns, however, which I believe they are right here, let's play them. You can kind of tell how the horn and choir almost kind of dance around each other in terms of who actually who is actually leading the melody. However, it's mostly the choir which has that driving force. And I would also like to point out how this section actually almost sounds even larger than the previous loud section, and I believe this is in part due to the choir here. So just for like really easy reference, let's actually play this entire section real quick so you can actually hear of what I'm saying. This section is intended to be big, loud, and epic, and you can't really get bigger, louder, and more epic than a choir. So now, let's discuss reverb. Epic trailer music likes width and size, and the room where we had this track recorded had its own reverb, of course. And let me actually demonstrate that with a real quick example here. I'm gonna string here, so I'm thinking. Like, you can really hear it there. However, I really wanted to essentially improve on it and make it sound even larger. So, I used reverb throughout this track. However, I used it in fairly specific ways and only in certain sections, and also in certain instruments. So let's start with the intro as well. So first of all, I have a reverb bus here, which I am routing all of my instrument groups into, except for synths and also hits. Now, this will essentially make it so that whatever parameters I set for the reverb will apply effectively to the entire track. It also saves on processing power, which is something that admittedly took me a couple years to realize. My poor computer. You can also see, if I open up my reverb settings here, that I have mix set to very high, and I also have the decay set to a little under 5 seconds. And this essentially makes it so that this bus is almost exclusively reverb. You'll also see on my reverb track here, I have some volume automation going for it throughout the duration of this track. And specifically, I actually completely remove the reverb for the more action-packed sequences, and I bring in the reverb again for the slower sections, like the pre-city theme here. Now, the reason for removing the reverb from the action-packed sequences is because there's already a lot happening sonically. So keeping the reverb in would have actually muddied things up and essentially made the instrument groups less punchy. And actually, let me show you an example of what it would sound like if I actually left the reverb in for, like, you know, this action sequence here. So let me turn this up, and we'll start like a back here. Actually, my bad. Right. So you can kind of tell what I'm referring to when the reverb actually kind of makes things more blurry, and it kind of ruins the clarity and punchiness of all of the instruments. And just so you have a easy reference, let's hear the same section once again without reverb as it was at first. You can really hear the difference that removing the reverb actually makes here. So now let's examine a slower section, like about here at 10 seconds, and let me also turn off the reverb here as well. You can tell it already sounds pretty good. However, personally, it sounds a bit too dry, especially in the clarinet. Like, how the clarinet sounds, it almost sounds Like it isn't really fitting in with the mix itself properly. So actually, let me play that one more time, just so you can kind of hear what I'm referencing here. Like it just sounds a bit too dry and close for me. And this section is essentially supposed to be a really dreamy and floaty section, kind of similar to like an establishing shot in a Disney film where like it's showcasing the really huge city where everything will happen. So if we play this section with the reverb enabled, you can tell that now things have a little more size to them, especially in the clarinet. Now it actually sounds like we are in the sky. Everything I have discussed here was essential for getting that really big and epic trailer sound. But now let's move on to Julie's vocals and how I mixed them in and also helped to give them an epic trailer sound. So vocals are a wild beast and is admittedly still something I'm grappling with. However, I think I did a fairly decent job of mixing them in with the full track. I'll also review each separate take of the vocals because I approached them in slightly different ways. So for the intro, I wanted Julie's vocals to essentially be the cornerstone of this section. I have a healthy mix of her dry vocal and the reverb, and also have her sitting directly in the center of the mix. Let me just play her vocal here. Now, recall how we left the center of the stereo image pretty clear when we were panning everything, so Julie's vocal fits really easily here. I also want to point out that I have the reverb for this section set at about -6.6 dB. I'll essentially be able to adjust how much reverb I want as the track progresses. So we go to the next take, for 052 here, or 053, I turned the reverb track itself down quite a few decibels, and I also increased the overall volume of her vocal. Additionally, I automated some EQ with a pretty hard reduction at roughly 300 Hz because these frequencies were making the mix sound a bit off. So let me demonstrate what I mean by playing this section without this EQ enabled. Let me solo that and do that. Okay. So as you can kind of hear, the vocal sounds a bit weird when we have that band disabled. And because of this, I automated the wetness of the EQ at this point to reduce those frequencies, and also left it like this for pretty much the rest of the track since I actually liked how it sounded. So let me go ahead and re-enable that. And also actually, while I'm thinking about it, I'll play it for you with this EQ adjustment in place here. You can kind of hear how it doesn't sound as off, essentially. So the last thing I did here was essentially automate the wetness of an exciter. And you can tell here, I have a lot of the excitation occurring at about, that looks like 878 Hertz and higher, which makes Julie's vocal pop out more in the mix. So for example, if I play this section without any excitation, here's how it sounds. You can tell how her vocal becomes somewhat buried in the mix without it. The other thing to note for this exciter is it's not always enabled. So like for example here in the slower sections, or like slower and softer sections, I only really have it enabled for these aggressive action-packed sequences where there's a higher chance her vocal would get buried underneath everything else. And I essentially try to view this exciter as a way to apply a surgical level of distortion to a track, and I also try to use it in such a way where you can feel the distortion rather than hear it. At 103 here, I really just automated the volume to essentially keep her vocal at the appropriate levels for this section. Ooh, cool. And here in the pre-city section, the main thing I want to point out here is I first of all disabled the exciter since this is a soft section, so the vocals should sound soft as well. And I also made the reverb much louder, as you can see right here. Essentially to the point where it overpowers the main drive vocal. And this was to essentially create that dreamy and floaty sound I really enjoy. So if we just silhouette. Play the full section. Okay. Then here, I significantly reduce the reverb to let Julie's drive vocal shine more. And then as the orchestra begins to crescendo, I slowly raise the volume of her vocal, and I also add in some more excitation, essentially give it the same rising power as the rest of the orchestra. Go. For this section here, this is one more epic action-packed section. However, you'll notice I actually have the exciter shut off here. And this is because Julie's performance here is already really strong in the frequencies I would excite, and it pokes through the mix just fine, especially with the syllables she chose to vocalize. But just so you can hear how it would sound if I added in excitation. You can tell it's actually a little too harsh. And in addition to this as well, we have some other basic volume automation, setting the reverb track at an appropriate level so it sounded cohesive with the rest of the mix, and so on. And then here for 301, I didn't really have to program any volume automation at all here, since everything at this point is essentially intended to sound loud and aggressive. And just to help her vocal kind of contribute to that, I also reintroduced the exciter. And yeah, that is pretty much how I approached mixing Julie's vocals. Overall, it wasn't super challenging, and at my current point, I feel like I have a good general idea of how vocals should usually sound in the mix, so that helps for sure. Alright, so for percussion, I'll only really cover the large ensembles that play throughout the entire track. Specifically, those are right here in the big drums folder. So here, I have a few percussion ensembles. I have epic toms, epic taikos, some instruments from Devastator Breakout, as well as Zenith. In terms of mixing, I mostly wanted to have the percussion underneath everything else, so they're not really super prominent in the mix. However, they serve as a really nice driving force and accent for like everything else. And also similar to the vocals, I have some pretty simple volume automation going to keep them at appropriate levels. And the other thing I want to mention as well is that, surprisingly, I didn't really add much, if any, additional reverb to these ensembles. The reverb you hear when I play, like, here, for example, is pretty much out of the box for every virtual instrument here. I was just sure to mix everything together volume-wise so that it all sounded cohesive and as a part of the same ensemble. Now for effects for this percussion, I first of all have a high shelf here to essentially boost the high frequency like just a little. And I also have some distortion to make the percussion a little harsher, as well as an exciter for just a little more surgical distortion in the higher frequencies. Mostly just kind of shaping the sound in like subtle ways. Now, the other percussive instrument I want to bring your attention to is the timpani. You'll notice that throughout the track, I have a fair bit of volume and exciter automation going. For the larger and more aggressive sections, I bring in the exciter to give the timpani more bite, and I then remove the exciter for the quieter parts. There's also a couple parts, in particular one section at about 3:11 here, where I make the timpani really prominent to emphasize the rhythm. Actually, I'll just let that play through. Yeah. You can tell that just for that small section, I have the timpani slightly louder along with the excitation. I thought it was really just a nice touch, and it honestly sounds really satisfying to listen to, especially in context of the full mix. Yeah. Now let's talk about hits. And my hits are pretty far down in the project here. And you'll actually be pretty surprised to hear I didn't really add too much effects processing to them. If I open up the effects here, I really just kind of added some distortion to all of the hits, specifically for a more aggressive sound. However, I didn't really add any extra reverb or anything like that. The main reason for this is because I wanted the hits to actually be one of the few elements in the mix which was as in your face as possible. When you hear the full mix, you can tell that they have a really clear and dry sound to them, and they also act as really excellent accents to huge chord changes and what have you. So like if we listen to 107 here, that, yeah. And I also want to briefly mention one of my favorite hits in the entire track is actually in the climax, and it is in between the section of 301 and about 305. So let me... Yeah. So that bang you heard at the end there is something I really quite enjoy. When I hear it, I like to imagine someone hitting just a massive drum as hard as they possibly can. But yeah, really, the hits were mostly untouched and just acted as a way to essentially help accent really powerful moments in the track. And that was how I mixed Arcane Skies. If you have any questions on anything, or want anything clarified, just let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and take care.